Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Unsolved Cases, because tonight we're going to be taking a look at a rather peculiar incident that occurred over 90 years ago, but still to this day remains unsolved. However, thanks to modern forensic science and cutting-edge technology, we can finally take an in-depth look at all the evidence that was presented at the scene, and piece together all of the clues that have eluded authorities for the past 9 decades. So join us as we finally discover exactly who burned down the Walton house. On a cool autumn day in 1936, in a place called Walton's Mountain, Virginia, there lived a poor yet close-knit family named the Waltons. They were good and honest folks who lived by the sweat of their brow and were well respected in their community. The patriarch of the Walton clan was John Walton Sr., a decent and honest man who owned and operated a local sawmill where he worked hard every day to provide for his large family, including his loving wife Olivia and their 7 children, Jim Bob, Elizabeth, Jason, Ben, Aaron, Mary Ellen, and the eldest child, John Walton Jr., often referred to as John Boy, as well as John's elderly parents, Zebulon and Esther. And though their house may have seemed crowded and chaotic at times, it was also full of love and good cheer. Until one tragic night when this loving family lost everything. It was just another day on Walton's Mountain. The children were at school, and the menfolk were toiling away at the sawmill, and the women of the house were busy preparing the evening meal. Meanwhile, John Boy, an aspiring writer, was hard at work writing his novel. And to better fit the role of a sophisticated author, he had recently taken to smoking a pipe. However, John Boy's parents were not particularly enthused by this new habit. As the evening grew late and the Waltons retired to their rooms for the night, Zebulon, the eldest Walton, had decided to use his electric heater to ward off the evening chill. Meanwhile, as John Boy turned in for the night, he had mistakenly forgot to properly extinguish his smoking pipe. And then, in the middle of the night, tragedy struck. The family awoke to a suffocating thick smoke billowing through the house. And as they scrambled out of their rooms in a panic, they were greeted by a blazing fire as it tore through their home. Luckily, the entire family managed to escape the blaze unharmed. However, most of their cherished belongings were not so fortunate. John Boy's novel, which he had poured his heart and soul into for many months, was tragically lost to the flames. After a thorough inspection of the scene, authorities were unable to ascertain exactly what had caused the fire. However, they were able to narrow it down to just 2 suspects. The first suspect being John Boy Walton, whose carelessness and failure to properly extinguish his smoldering pipe may have inadvertently caused the blaze. The second suspect is Zebulon Grandpa Walton, whose electric heater had possibly malfunctioned, which may have started an electrical fire resulting in the house's destruction. At this time, authorities have simply labeled this incident as a tragic accident and closed the case. However, I submit that this incident was no mere accident, and that the fire was deliberately set by person or persons unknown, and the list of suspects is far greater than what authorities had previously believed. And each one of these suspects has a clear motive as to why they would want to set fire to the Walton home. We'll begin with our first and most obvious suspect, the patriarch of the Walton clan, John Walton Sr. On the surface, John Walton may seem like an honest, hard-working man who's devoted to his family. However, there was another side to this man that few had often seen. It was no secret that John never really wanted to have children or a family. Ever since he was a child, he always dreamed of breaking away from the confines of Walton's Mountain and traveling the world and living life to its fullest. However, when he discovered that his girlfriend at the time, Olivia, had become pregnant, those dreams were quickly shattered. Originally, John wanted Olivia to give up the child. However, being a devout Christian, Olivia refused this request. So John had no choice but to do the honorable thing and marry her. And after the birth of their first son, John Walton Jr., they would soon be blessed with 6 more children. Over the years, John worked hard to support his family, but then the Great Depression came and money became extremely tight. John did the best he could to overcome these hardships. However, as the years went by, the stress of poverty and overwork finally became too much for the family breadwinner. And so one night he hatched a sinister plan. He would burn down the house and his family along with it, thus giving John a second chance at a life he always dreamed of. Is John Walton Sr. the type of man who would commit such a heinous act? Perhaps. Or perhaps the real person responsible is our next suspect, Mary Ellen Walton. The eldest daughter of the Walton clan, Mary Ellen, was known to be a very opinionated and free-spirited child with aspirations to one day become a nurse. However, it seemed that certain people had other plans for Mary Ellen. In particular, her grandmother, Esther Walton, who wanted Mary Ellen to give up her dreams of medical practice so that she could follow in the footsteps of the other Walton women by getting married, raising a family, and spending her life as a homemaker. Aspirations that Mary Ellen did not share. She wanted to live life on her own terms, and wasn't prepared to let others tell her what to do. And this difference of opinions caused a rift between Mary Ellen and her equally headstrong grandmother. And as time went by, the tensions only grew, until one day Mary Ellen finally had enough of her grandmother's intrusions and decided that the only way she could truly live her life was to get rid of not only her grandmother, but the rest of her family as well. With them out of the picture, Mary Ellen could finally focus on attaining her dreams. So one night she concocted an evil scheme and set fire to the Waltons' home, hoping to get rid of her controlling family once and for all. Did Mary Ellen set fire to her family's house, or was it somebody else, somebody with a similar motive, somebody like Benjamin Walton? Ben Walton was the 3rd son of the Walton clan. Growing up, he had dreams of setting out into the world and making a name for himself. However, his father John had other plans. He wanted Ben to stay on Walton's Mountain and one day take over the family sawmill, a dream that Ben obviously didn't share, and said as much. While John could only voice his disappointments, seeing Ben's refusal to take over the sawmill as a slap in the face to everything John had worked his entire life for. The two would clash over the matter time and again, until one day Ben Walton had finally lost control. He wanted to leave Walton's Mountain and follow his dreams, and he was prepared to do it by any means necessary, even if it meant burning down the family home. Is Ben Walton responsible for burning down the Walton house, or is he just another innocent victim in this heinous crime? Perhaps the true perpetrator is none other than his sister, Erin Walton. Erin Walton is the middle daughter of John and Olivia, and throughout her entire life she strived to break free of what was known as middle child syndrome. She was desperate to be recognized for her own merits and her own achievements, and even entered a local beauty pageant to prove her worth to her family. However, when her father learned of this pageant, in particular the swimsuit competition, he refused to allow Erin to participate, telling her, "No daughter of mine is going to embarrass his family by parading half naked in front of the town like some Jezebel." Heartbroken and angry that her dreams had been crushed, Erin returned to her room and thought of a way to exact revenge on her overprotective father. And one day she decided to act, bringing fiery retribution to those she felt wronged her. Did Erin Walton set the house ablaze? Would losing her chance to enter a beauty pageant be enough for her to commit such an act? Possibly, yet highly unlikely. Our next suspect has his own personal reasons for wanting to exact revenge on his family, and that person is the 2nd son of the Walton clan, Jason Walton. Since he was a young boy, Jason was always fascinated by music, and decided long ago that he wanted to be a musician. His parents supported his dream, and he began practicing both the piano and the guitar as often as possible. And over the years he had become quite proficient, even landing the occasional gig at local dances and fairs where he would amaze the crowd with his music. Years later, with the desire to not only make a name for himself, but to also make a little bit of money, Jason managed to land a job playing piano at a seedy burlesque house called the Magnolia Blossom Theater. However, when his mother Olivia learned of this new employment, she had become quite upset and was heard to say, "How you can play for a trashy girly show on Saturday and then go to church on Sunday is beyond my understanding," thus forcing Jason to quit his new job. So now, without money and his musical career in a slump, the young man became sullen and spiteful. And those feelings continued to swell within him until one day the anger boiled over and he decided that he was going to make his family pay. And after many nights of bringing the house down with his music, he would go on to bring the house down with a can of kerosene and a book of matches. Is Jason Walton a cold-blooded arsonist hell-bent on revenge? Or is he just another victim in a terrible tragedy? Perhaps the real culprit is somebody the authorities had overlooked, somebody who spent her entire life being overlooked. Our next suspect is none other than the youngest of the Walton family, Elizabeth Walton. Growing up as the youngest child in such a large family was not easy for Elizabeth. With everyone else busy with their own lives and their own problems, it seemed that nobody had the time for the rambunctious young child. And over time, being the forgotten child left Elizabeth with feelings of bitterness and resentment towards the rest of the family. A bitterness that eventually turned to hatred, and soon she came to realize that if her family didn't have time for her in their lives, then she didn't need them in hers. And on one quiet night, the baby of the Walton clan reminded her family that she still existed with a declaration of fire. Many people would assume that such a young and innocent child could never be capable of such an atrocious act. However, in this world, anything is possible. Take, for example, our next suspect, Jim Bob Walton. The youngest son of John and Olivia, Jim Bob Walton lived his life with his head in the clouds, which seems rather poetic considering that his life's ambition is to one day be an airplane pilot. However, there was one major flaw in Jim Bob's plans. According to our sources, Jim Bob was not a very bright child. On numerous occasions, Jim Bob found himself being scolded by his parents about his poor grades at school. Some have even speculated that Jim Bob may have suffered from some form of attention deficit disorder. However, given the lack of proper medical science in 1930s Virginia, Jim Bob was never diagnosed nor treated for such a condition. And most people who knew him assumed that he was just an imbecile and treated him as such. And obviously, over time, Jim Bob became angry and resentful at being treated like the village idiot, especially by his own mocking siblings. And soon that anger turned to vengeful hatred, a hatred that needed to be unleashed with furious vengeance. And on one chilly autumn night, Jim Bob decided it was time to teach his family a painful lesson. Despite being an idiot and subjected to the mockery of his family, was Jim Bob Walton capable of committing such a crime? Many would argue that he lacked the intelligence to hatch such a scheme. But if it weren't Jim Bob Walton, then who? Perhaps somebody outside of the family. Perhaps two people. Two people who were hell-bent on exacting revenge on the Walton family. Two people such as the Baldwin sisters. Mamie and Emily Baldwin were two wealthy, genteel women who symbolized family tradition and heritage. They spoke fondly of their father, who they referred to as the Judge, and until their dying day would continue producing their father's bootleg moonshine that they referred to as the Recipe, a concoction heavily enjoyed by Zebulon Grandpa Walton. The Baldwin sisters were well liked by almost everybody on Walton's Mountain, everybody except for Zebulon's wife, Esther Grandma Walton, who not only considered the production of their moonshine to be a sinful act, but was also quite jealous of their close friendship with her husband Zebulon. On many nights, Esther would have to make the trek to the Baldwins' lavish estate to bring her inebriated husband back home. And as she did, she let the Baldwin ladies know exactly how she felt about them. Truly, there was no love lost between these women. And then finally, growing tired of her husband's predilections for the Baldwin's company and their recipe, Esther gave the Baldwins an ultimatum. They would either cut ties with Zebulon, or Esther would tell the authorities about the Baldwins' illegal moonshine production. The Baldwin sisters did not take that lightly. They were quite enraged at the audacity of Esther Walton. How dare she threaten two women of high social standing and exceptional breeding? And the thought of not only losing one of their closest friends, but also their moonshine business, had driven the Baldwin sisters to their breaking point. If Esther Walton wanted trouble, she was going to get more than she bargained for. And the Baldwin sisters knew more than anybody that moonshine is a very flammable substance. And they had more than enough to take down the Walton house if they wanted to. Did the Baldwin sisters burn down the Walton house? They certainly had the means and the motive, and as they say, anything is possible. However, let us not overlook our next suspect, the last person on Walton's Mountain that anybody would suspect, the good Reverend Matthew Fordwick. Matthew Fordwick came to Walton's Mountain with a dream to spread the word of God to this small community, and he was successful in doing so. Every Sunday morning, the good people would come to his church and listen to his sermons and find comfort in his faith. However, there was one person on Walton's Mountain that didn't share the good Reverend's faith, John Walton Sr. On numerous occasions, John Walton stated that he had no need for religion, and despite many attempts by both his wife Olivia and his mother Esther, John adamantly refused to attend Sunday Mass. And this decision no doubt troubled the Walton women. However, none were more displeased by John's lack of faith than Reverend Fordwick. He took John's attitude toward God as a personal insult and a slap in the face to all he believed in. And unlike the good Lord, he was not about to turn the other cheek. So after months of prayer and soul searching, the good Reverend decided that if John Walton was going to refuse God's love, then he was going to show him God's wrath. And so with Bible in hand and conviction in his soul, Reverend Fordwick traveled to the top of Walton's Mountain like Moses to Mount Sinai, and gave John Walton a glimpse of the fiery hell that awaited his eternal soul. Now, most people would dismiss Reverend Fordwick as the culprit in this case, being a man of peace and God. But if that were true, then how do you explain that just a year later, Reverend Fordwick decided to leave Walton's Mountain and bring his gospel elsewhere? He claimed that he wanted to move forward and start a new chapter in his life, but was that really the truth? Or did he really leave Walton's Mountain because he knew that it was only a matter of time before the authorities would link him to this heinous crime and would eventually catch up to him? But perhaps he really was telling the truth and is completely innocent of any wrongdoing. And if so, then that leaves only one suspect left on this list, Cora Beth Godsey. Yes, the cultured and educated wife of general store owner Ike Godsey and second cousin of the Walton clan certainly had the motive for such an act. Ever since she was a young child, Cora Beth Walton spent much of her time absorbed in the finer things of life. She lived life with grace, etiquette, and a deep knowledge of fine arts. She wore clothing and hats that most women on Walton's Mountain could never afford, and had always dreamed of a life surrounded by luxury and extravagance. However, when the isolated and lonely Cora Beth reluctantly agreed to marry the town merchant, Ike Godsey, after her mother had passed away, all of her dreams of luxury quickly shattered. And she soon found herself living amongst the common peasants of Walton's Mountain, working alongside her simple-minded husband in his general store. Yet she still longed for the life of elegance that she believed she deserved. And on numerous instances, she tried convincing her husband to sell his general store so that the two could travel abroad to places renowned for its class and sophistication, like Italy or Paris. However, Ike steadily refused her request, noting that his general store was necessary for the community and that he couldn't get rid of it when people like the Walton family heavily relied on his services. So Cora Beth came to the realization that the only way she could achieve the life that she felt she deserved was to get rid of the Waltons. With the majority of his customers out of the way, Ike would have no choice but to close the general store and finally give Cora Beth the life she always wanted. So one night, after pilfering a can of kerosene from the general store, Cora Beth made the long walk to the Walton residence, where she would enact the first part of her grand scheme. And even though the Waltons were her family, she refused to let anything stand in her way. Was Cora Beth Godsey responsible for the fire? Could a person of such culture and etiquette be capable of such a crime? Many would say no. However, when somebody wants something so badly, I propose that anything is possible. And that concludes our list of suspects. 11 people, each one carrying a valid motive to commit such a crime. However, which one is truly responsible? Unfortunately, we may never know the truth. We've just received an important update from the Virginia State Police. After re-examining the case, they have finally discovered exactly who is responsible for the Walton House fire. And that culprit is none other than Yancey Tucker. With evidence found at the scene, along with a recently discovered signed confession, it appears that local ne'er-do-well and known chicken thief Yancey Tucker has been identified as the man responsible for setting fire to the Walton house. According to his confession, Tucker stated that his reason was jealousy for the Walton family. Living a life of poverty inside a dirty shack on the outside of town, Yancey Tucker saw everything the Waltons had that he never did. A loving family living in a large house full of hot food, clean water, and warm beds. To Yancey Tucker, the Waltons had everything he could ever hope for. And over the years, as he dwelled in his shack, eating beans from a can and drowning his sorrows with a bottle of stump liquor, that jealousy continued to fester like an open wound until he finally snapped. And on one dark night, an extremely drunk and angry Tucker stumbled to the Walton home and set it ablaze before passing out in the nearby barn. He woke the next morning and managed to return home without anybody seeing him. And although authorities never tied him to the crime, Yancey Tucker spent the remainder of his life racked with guilt and remorse until his dying day. So there you have it, folks. A drunk and destitute man filled with bitter resentment who acted out of pure rage, only to spend his remaining days filled with sorrow and regret. Next week, we take a look at an incident involving a young man who vanished from his family home without a trace. So join us next time as we investigate the disappearance of Chuck Cunningham.